Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. It is my pleasure to welcome you to the first S.R. Nathan Fellowship Young Leaders Seminar titled Shaping Singapore's Climate Future, Achieving NDCs with the Use of Carbon Markets. Our keynote speaker for today will be Ms. Melissa Low, Research Fellow at NUS's Center for Nature-Based Climate Solutions. Following her keynote address, Ms. Low will be joined by Mr. Ruben Manukara, Global Lead, Carbon Finance and Markets Task Force at the Worldwide Fund for Nature International, WWF, and Mr. Ho Xiang Tian, co-founder of Lepak in SG, for a panel discussion. The panel discussion and subsequent Q&A session will be moderated by Ms. Kong Man Jing, co-founder of Just Keep Thinking. Before we begin, please allow me to go over some housekeeping rules for the event. Thank you for joining us at the auditorium today. Please be reminded to switch your mobile phones to silent mode. The lecture is being streamed live on Facebook. It will also be recorded and uploaded onto our IPS website and our social media platforms later. Please submit your comments and questions at any time during the lecture through the Facebook comments. For our audience members here at the auditorium today, please step up to the mic during the Q&A session to ask your questions. We'll try our best to answer as many questions as we can during the Q&A. We would also like to hear your views on the event. There will be a QR code on the screen and a link in the feed at the end of the lecture to submit your feedback. Without further ado, Director of IPS, Janadas Devon, will now deliver his opening remarks. Director, please.
Very short opening remarks. This actually is our first S.R. Nathan Fellowship Young Leaders Seminar ever. So our keynote speaker today is Ms. Melissa Low. As you just heard, she's a research fellow at the NUS Center for Nature-Based Climate Solutions. I'm very heartened by the size of the audience because I expected fewer people to turn up. It's actually more than what we have for the S.R. Nathan, some of the S.R. Nathan Fellowship. So it's rather auspicious. We conceived this Young Leaders Seminar series as a departure from the traditional IPS Nathan lecture series, where we invite people, more senior Singaporeans, more people who look like me, to share their insights on various topics. And the S.R. Nathan lectures vary from 3 to 6 lectures, and now we've settled on about 3 lectures every semester. And I think we have had, I've lost count, I think we have had about 15 S.R. Nathan fellows. And the full title for the fellowship is rather cumbersome, the S.R. Nathan Fellowship for the Study of Singapore. I think we are having the 16th S.R. Nathan Fellow next week. Philip Yeo is coming along. And so the Young Leaders Seminar Series aims to provide a platform for younger Singaporeans below the age of 40 who possess valuable and pertinent insights to share on topics of importance to Singapore. I actually wanted under 35 because I belong to the generation, the 60s. We used to have a saying, don't trust anyone over the age of 35. And I used to believe it. But the IPS fellows disagreed. They didn't think that 35 would be a suitable cutoff age. So we compromised on 40. Today's seminar is titled Shaping Singapore's Climate Future, Achieving NDCs with the Use of Carbon Markets. It will focus, I'm told, on the crucial role of carbon markets in addressing climate change in Singapore. Melissa will share with us her research on transparency and accountability in carbon markets and offer insights into how policy frameworks can drive meaningful change. Following her keynote, there'll be a panel discussion. I thank the people who were listed just now, Ruben of the Worldwide Fund for Nature and Xian Tian, co-founder of Lepak, for agreeing to join the panel discussion. The moderator is, what was her name? BioGirl MJ. She will later explain what that means for moderating the discussions. I thank all of you for joining us, and I thank the panel and Melissa. Thank you.
Thank you, Director. Ladies and gentlemen, without further ado, I would like to invite Ms. Melissa Low to deliver her keynote address. Ms. Low, please.
Okay, all right. Good afternoon, everybody. It is a great honor to be named the inaugural S.R. Nathan Young Leader. I'd like to thank Director Janadas Devon, Director of the Institute of Policy Studies, and his team at IPS for inviting me today and for putting this event together. Thank you to everyone as well who made the time to be here today, and for those who are also joining us online. I look forward to engaging with you during the panel discussion. So I've never met President or the late President S.R. Nathan in person, but I keep a copy of his memoir, An Unexpected Journey, on my bookshelf. In fact, I got the book through someone else, through a book swap initiative that I organized called Books and Beer. The goal of Books and Beer as an initiative is to encourage reading and recycling. And it was actually founded in 2011, the year that S.R. Nathan stepped down as President of Singapore. And of course, most of you know he was President of Singapore from 1st of September 1999 to 1st of September 2011. This is not insignificant for me because I entered secondary school, so you know my age now, in year 2000. And I graduated from university in 2010. So not only was President S.R. Nathan the longest-serving president of Singapore, he was also serving throughout my schooling years. Like President Nathan, I consider my journey in the climate policy space to be an unexpected one. And I often joke that when I entered NUS as an undergraduate, back in 2006, I actually never left after I entered in 2006. I'm still here. I entered NUS as a young geography major in 2006, and NUS was at the time celebrating its centennial year, 100. And this year, NUS is celebrating its 120th year. So that's how long I've been here. But unlike President S.R. Nathan, my journey hasn't been quite as extraordinary. I will elaborate in my speech later, you'll hear, on shaping Singapore's climate future, achieving NDCs with the use of carbon markets, that much of what I have done is not a direct, much of what Singapore has done is not a direct product of what I have achieved alone, but of global shifts, and this translates into domestic changes here in Singapore. And I've been privileged to witness the mindset shift here in Singapore and the actions from around the world in addressing climate change since I entered university till today. During these last 2 decades, Singapore underwent significant changes, partly in response to global developments, but also as the country recognized how vulnerable it was to the impact of climate change, and that it was a global challenge that required, well, a global response. Now the slides come out. Okay. So in 2006, the year that I entered NUS, Singapore acceded to the Kyoto Protocol. I'm sure many of you know about the Kyoto Protocol. In 2007, our then Prime Minister Lee Hsien Loong attended the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, COP13, in Bali, Indonesia, and delivered a speech outlining principles for a post-2012 framework. That same year, the Interministerial Committee on Climate Change was also established, and this was chaired by then SM S. Jayakumar. And in my final year of university in 2009, I had the wonderful opportunity to participate in my first COP, the Copenhagen Climate Summit, otherwise known as COP15, as part of a self-funded youth delegation organized by Eco Singapore. And PM Lee, of course, also attended COP15 alongside several heads of states. And in his national statement, PM Lee announced Singapore's first ever climate target, which in the context of a legally binding global agreement, Singapore would undertake to reduce emissions growth by 16% below business as usual by 2020. PM Lee also spoke of the collective responsibility of countries to make progress in reducing greenhouse gas emissions, knowing that the outcome would not be final or complete to climate change. Back in 2009, PM Lee said that over the next decades, countries will have to discuss and agree further steps to manage the problem. And on the sidelines of COP15, our youth delegation even got to meet PM Lee to discuss our concerns. And if you search hard enough, the video of the youth interacting with PM is still on YouTube for anyone who's interested. But for me, this was the start of a very exciting journey of discovery as I dived head into climate policy and wanted to understand the role of the UNFCCC in shaping countries' domestic climate policy. The National Climate Change Secretariat was established on 1st July 2010 under the Prime Minister's Office, PMO, to develop and implement Singapore's domestic and international policies and strategies to tackle climate change. That same year, I also entered the Energy Studies Institute here at NUS and had the opportunity to listen to PM Lee deliver a speech at the 3rd Singapore International Energy Week. I'm not sure how many of you remember that event. Looking back at it, that was when Singapore announced or broached the possibility of a carbon price back in 2010. PM noted that the government was already working with a shadow carbon price, and that such a price might eventually have to be made explicit in order to send the right price signals if there would be a global legally binding agreement to curb greenhouse gases and where Singapore would be called upon to participate. However, it would not be until 2017 that Singapore would formally announce a plan to implement a carbon tax. And the Carbon Pricing Act is what forms the foundation of Singapore's international carbon credit framework, which I will be discussing later today in this speech. Now, the Paris Agreement. Usually at this point in the lecture that I give, I like to ask for a show of hands as to how many of you have downloaded and read a copy of the Paris Agreement. May I have a show of hands of who has actually read the Paris Agreement, please? Oh, 2 people in front, and then maybe a couple at the back. Okay, all right, so I've got my work cut out for me today. Okay, so it's only been 10 years, there's still time, okay? So as I said, it's only been 10 years since the Paris Agreement was signed in December 2015, so it's not too late to pick it up. And for those of you who have read it, the handful of you who have read it, I'm sure you'll agree with me that the Paris Agreement is actually very easy to read. Surprisingly, perhaps easy to read. It's only 16 pages long, and it was intentionally written in a way that would be accessible to people. Unlike the Paris Agreement's predecessor, the Kyoto Protocol, which required 37 countries to come up with, it's a long name, Quantified Emissions Limitations and Reductions Objectives, CALROs for short, over a 5-year commitment period, the Paris Agreement applies to all countries. And there is no expiry date, because the Paris Agreement has a built-in ratchet and review system every 5 years. So it really isn't too late to pick up a copy of the Paris Agreement and to understand its contents. What drew me to the Paris Agreement all those years ago was the opportunity for us, the whole world, to refresh our ability to address climate change. One of the key features of the Paris Agreement is the nationally determined contribution, which of course is in the title of today's talk. I don't have time to go into detail or the history of the NDCs today and how the term came about, but I do want to say that Singapore had a hand in helping to broker this term, which helped more countries become more comfortable with the idea of submitting an intention or an intended nationally determined contribution prior to the Paris Summit in COP21. And this in turn led to the early entry into force of the Paris Agreement in just 11 months after it was signed. Singapore, like many countries that are party to the Paris Agreement, submitted an intended nationally determined contribution in 2015, prior to Paris. Right? We agreed to reduce emissions intensity by 36% by 2030 compared to a base year of 2005 level, and announced our intention to stabilize emissions around 2030. And then you fast forward 5 years later, when the next window opened, 2020, Singapore submitted an updated first NDC aimed at peaking emissions around 65 million tonnes of CO2 equivalent by 2030, shifting from an emissions intensity target to a more concrete emissions cap. This also marked the first time that Singapore set a specific emissions peak target. Then in 2022, following a call by COP26 President Alok Sharma for parties to review and strengthen their NDCs, Singapore, along with some 20 countries, updated the NDCs further. And in this second update, Singapore's then DPM, now PM Lawrence Wong, announced Singapore's intention to reduce emissions to 60 million tonnes of CO2 equivalent after peaking emissions earlier. And through a parliamentary clarification, we understood that emissions peak would not exceed the first NDC level of 65 million tonnes, and the peak would also likely happen sometime between 2025 and 2028. That's more. So NDCs are underpinned by two very important pillars of the Paris Agreement: the Enhanced Transparency Framework and the Global Stocktake. But due to time constraints today, I will just discuss the Enhanced Transparency Framework under the Paris Agreement. So under the Paris Agreement, countries must submit a biennial transparency report every 2 years, as the name suggests, biennial, right? And this has to start as of late last year, which is December 31st, 2024, in order to track progress in implementing and achieving NDCs. And not doing so, not submitting the BTRs, means that a party is not compliant with the Paris Agreement. But more than this, the biennial transparency report is also an important vehicle for reporting on the use of international carbon credits towards countries' NDCs, as I will explain shortly. In Singapore's first ever submitted biennial transparency report, and you can find this online, which we published on the 11th of November 2024, the country announced two very important things for the first time. First, it announced its peak year, exactly in 2028, projected, of course, at 64.43 million tonnes. And number two, it estimates that that we intend to use 2.51 million tonnes of CO2 per annum through the use of internationally transferred mitigation outcomes, or international carbon credits for short, over the NDC implementation of 10 years. So I've provided a couple of tables and a graph from Singapore's first biennial transparency report here today to illustrate the projections of Singapore's overall emissions, inclusive of the projected use of international carbon credits. So on 10th of February this year, which was pretty recent, Singapore submitted its second NDC, which is the 2035 NDC. And for the first time, Singapore's NDC features a downward emissions trajectory. So we peaked, and then we're coming down, finally. And this emissions trajectory aims to take us from 60 million tonnes of CO2 equivalent to 45 to 50 million tonnes in 2035. This marks, as I said, the first time that we have a downward emissions trajectory, although it remains to be seen how we will get there. It will likely have to be a mix of decarbonization, using low carbon technologies, and switching to alternative fuels such as hydrogen, or adoption of carbon capture, utilization, and storage, and carbon offsets. Of course, all of this followed developments under Article 6 of the Paris Agreement, and I'm very proud to say that Singapore contributed to these outcomes. The first set of decisions really came out of the Glasgow COP26 back in 2021, where Singapore's Minister for Sustainability and the Environment, Ms. Grace Fu, co-chaired ministerial level negotiations alongside her counterpart from Norway, and Minister Fu was later invited again with New Zealand's Minister for Climate Change to co-chair negotiations on Article 6 at COP29 last year in Baku, Azerbaijan. So she was the common denominator across the two COPs. These decisions provided clear signals to the market to unlock investment in activities, to reduce emissions and enable countries to work together to meet their climate targets. So let us now zoom in on the use of international carbon credits towards meeting Singapore's own NDCs. The main legislative tool you want to pay attention to is the Carbon Pricing Act. And this was first introduced in 2018 and entered into force in 2019. And this act required Singapore's top emitters to pay a carbon tax under a fixed price credit-based framework. As I understand, carbon tax liable companies have to calculate their emissions and obtain fixed price carbon credits from the government and then surrender it at the end of the taxable year. The Carbon Pricing Act in 2018 was then amended in 2022 to support Singapore's raised ambition level of achieving net zero by 2050. And these legislative amendments allowed the carbon tax liable firms to surrender one eligible fixed price carbon credit, it allowed the companies to surrender an international carbon credit in place of a fixed price carbon credit. This means that firms will still need to pay okay, they only can do so up to 5% of their tax liability, and this means that they'll have to pay still 95% of their carbon tax liability at the prevailing carbon price. The prevailing carbon price as of this year is 25 Singapore dollars. Next year, the carbon price will be increased to 45 Singapore dollars per tonne, and by the end of the decade, the carbon price will be raised further to $50 to $80 per tonne. But this rate has not yet been announced. It is also important, of course, not to just pay attention to the formal legislation, but also to take note of the accompanying regulations, as well as any updates to the eligible methodologies, it's a mouthful, to be reviewed every year. So I want to point your attention to the International Carbon Credits Guidance document that you can find online as well. Okay, in October 2023, Singapore released these 7 principles of, we call the environmental integrity principles, to ensure credibility and integrity of Article 6 cooperation. On 19th of December the same year, the eligibility list under the International Carbon Credit Framework was formally published by the Ministry of Sustainability and Environment and National Environment Agency. And upon close reading of the Singapore eligibility criteria, I note that it was based primarily on the Article 6 guidance that came out of COP26, which gave us a definition of what indeed are internationally transferred mitigation outcomes. For example, ITMOs must be real, additional, verified, and quantified, and they cannot be double counted in the host country and the acquiring country. This is avoided through corresponding adjustments. But I'd like to zoom in on the principles, these 3 principles specifically, right? Singapore says that the use of international carbon credits in our system and use towards its NDC has to be permanent, it should cause no net harm, and do not cause carbon leakage. In including these specific requirements, Singapore appears to be adding guidance to Article 6.2 by stating its preference and taking additional precautions around the type of international carbon credits that it allows to be used towards its NDC. And based on my reading of Singapore's eligibility criteria, the country has actually gone beyond what is required at the international level under Article 6.2 because, for example, in the permanence principle, the Article 6.2 requirement only requires information for the risk of non-permanence, right? But in Singapore's case, we've stated permanent. On leakage, there are references to addressing uncertainties in quantification and potential leakage in the Article 6.2 guidance, but in Singapore's case, the carbon credits cannot cause leakage at all, right? So it's stricter than usual. So all of this is located in the decision text, and you can go online to find it if you like. There are references to avoidance of leakage, minimization of risk of leakage, adjusting for remaining leakage, and all this in the mechanism methodologies to measure leakage under Article 6.4. So Singapore has actually borrowed Article 6.4 rules, which was not decided until COP29 last year, into Article 6.2. So Article 6.2 actually is less strict than Singapore, right? And then under in this case, I would say that countries that want to participate in Singapore's international carbon credit framework will have to do more than what is required. Singapore has gone a step further to require all of this, and since that Article 6 does not require it. Okay, I'm just waiting for the... Okay, yeah, so on the no net harm principle, I should like to add also, my understanding is that the no net harm principle came from the International Civil Aviation Organization's Carbon Offsetting and Reduction Scheme for International Aviation, or CORSIA for short, right? And this came from their integrity assessment criteria. Singapore definition of the no net harm criteria nearly matches the one found in CORSIA emissions unit eligibility criteria word for word. For the CORSIA criteria, it is defined as offset projects that should not violate local, state, provincial, national, international regulations or obligations, while the Singapore criteria states that no net harm means that the project or program that generated the certified emissions reductions or removals must not violate any applicable laws, regulatory requirements, international organizations of the host country. The key difference being that Singapore's no net harm criteria is mandatory, while CORSIA's is not. In this way, Singapore has set a higher criteria and standard for international carbon credits for use in its own system. Now, having set out how Singapore intends to use international carbon credits or ITMOs towards achieving its NDCs, I'd like to turn to some observations about how the use of these guidance and rules can or cannot be enforced in areas where we need perhaps more clarity on. First, to participate in Article 6 mechanisms, and specifically Article 6.2, which is the bilateral trading of carbon credits, countries need to meet certain reporting requirements under the rules set out from COP26 and subsequent COPs. For instance, countries need to submit an initial report containing comprehensive information to demonstrate that it fulfills responsibilities and its ability to authorize the use of these ITMOs and has arrangements in place to track and report as well as to apply corresponding adjustments. Such descriptions will help increase the trust between the two participating countries and reduce uncertainty and provides a roadmap to follow. Countries also need to submit annual information and regular information containing information about authorization of ITMOs for the use towards their own NDCs or other international mitigation purpose such as CORSIA. Some of this information goes into a centralized accounting and reporting platform or the Article 6 database using an internationally agreed electronic format as well as the biannual transparency report. Thus, the biannual transparency report is actually a really important vehicle for the reporting of the use of ITMOs towards a country's NDC. However, because a set of countries is involved in a bilateral carbon trade, both countries must provide the information, and this information must tally in order for it to count. Although Singapore has a stellar track record in submitting its biannual update reports, which is the predecessor to the biannual transparency reports, on time, and usually Singapore is one of the top 3 countries to submit its BURs, and we've also submitted our first BTRs. The countries that host the carbon projects and from whom we procure the ITMOs must also submit their BTRs. The second concern that I have with this BTR, so the first concern being that 2 countries must submit, right, in order for it to tally. The second concern I have is the intrinsic time lag that's involved. As some of you may be aware, the data requirement within these biannual transparency reports is 2 years old, i.e. X minus 2. In the 2024 submission, countries submit 2022 data only, and so on, because the time required for countries to collate this data takes about 2 years, right? And all of the activity data has to be put together in their national greenhouse gas inventory. So for the first time, the first time we will know whether a country has actually met their 2030 NDC is not in 2030 itself, but in 2032, right? Because there's a time lag of 2 years. And because the NDCs, the next NDC is set for an odd year, 2035, the next biannual transparency report that would show if Singapore has met its own NDC in 2035 will be in 2038, right? Because the 2036 BTR will only contain 2034 data. And so this is not in time to show our achievement of NDCs. So there are also other concerns here. The Article 6.2 decisions that came out of COP29 in Baku last year provided additional clarification on such timing in order to try and reduce the uncertainty. The centralized accounting and reporting platform will need to be updated in between the biannual transparency report year submissions, and the updates to the CARP need to be done 1 year in advance of a BTR, which should help to catch any inconsistencies in transactions or applying corresponding adjustments. The observation I've made here is that we've focused too much on Singapore's own transparency reporting, perhaps, and we can submit our own BURs and BTRs on time. But as we enter bilateral carbon trading with host countries, transparency must be co-produced with other countries. And so Singapore would do well to focus more attention on the host country's abilities to fulfill the terms of participation. But put plainly, we do not have jurisdiction over other countries' domestic processes. We cannot make them or will them to submit a BTR or update the annual information or regular information on time if they do not wish to. But if they do not do that, then their transactions will be marked as inconsistent with ours, right? And at COP29, parties were asked to not include such inconsistent transactions as part of the NDCs. So using transactions labeled as checked but inconsistent may open the door for buyers who have contracted volumes to be subjected to unresolved issues and hence to potential integrity concerns. A second update from COP29 is that the Article 6 Technical Expert Review Team, or the TERT, can determine whether or not identified inconsistencies are significant and or persistent. And if so, they can highlight this in their report on the review when they've done so. This new decision coming out of Baku encourages also the lead reviewer of Article 6 TERT to liaise with the Secretariat directly and with the Article 15 Paris Agreement Implementation and Compliance Committee with respect to significant and persistent inconsistencies. However, as I understand, the Paris Agreement's Article 15 Paris Agreement Implementation Compliance Committee, PIC for short, can only initiate a review if a party fails to respond to repeated recommendations to improve its performance and inconsistencies persist. And when significant and persistent inconsistencies are there, then the threshold may have been crossed. Please also note that the PIC only initiates a consideration of issues derived from a recommendation from the Technical Expert Review Report after the review of a biennial transparency report submission. So this has to be done after the BTR is submitted and not just the Article 6 information. This can only be done with the consent of the respective country as well. Furthermore, Article 15 of the Paris Agreement provides that the PIC functions in a facilitative manner rather than a punitive or an adversarial way in order to facilitate compliance with the Paris Agreement rather than to sanction issues of non-compliance. So there is no enforcement within the Paris Agreement, and the PIC does not consider, adjudicate, and even take mandatory measures on whether or not NDCs are met. Furthermore, the PIC is largely determined by the willingness of parties to engage with these processes. So it is important to point out that there is no defined threshold also for what is considered significant and persistent within the rules of the PIC. Though the term's plain language, so what is the plain language of persistent and inconsistent, is when a party fails to respond to repeated recommendations to improve its performance and inconsistencies continue to persist. So this, in my view, is maybe 3 cycles of the biennial transparency report, and non-compliance will only be picked up and addressed after multiple cycles, which means that it could be too late after a country's NDCs have supposed to be met. It could be up to 6 to 7 years before the PIC can pick up on inconsistencies. So what can Singapore do to reduce the risk of this? So I've given you here some examples of Singapore as a responsible acquiring country. We have already started to engage with host countries to ensure that they have ambitious climate targets, robust climate policies and domestic legislation, and institutional arrangements to participate in Article 6. And importantly, they must also have measurement, reporting, and verification capabilities and a track record, right, to submitting their biennial update reports and biennial transparency reports. If the Singapore government or carbon tax-paying firms are looking to buy nature-based solutions, then they should also make sure that the host country has a forest reference emissions level or forest reference level. And Singapore must continue to have an excellent track record, but we must also start, if we haven't already done so, to pay attention and seek clarity on how to facilitate implementation and compliance and helping our counterparts and host countries to build the necessary skills and knowledge in the area of transparency and accountability in order to operationalize what we call the G2G, government-to-government, Article 6 carbon credit implementation agreements. I understand that Singapore has made some strides in this area through our partnership with Japan on the Partnership to Strengthen Transparency for Co-Innovation, PASTI for short, and to improve transparency of greenhouse gas inventory work through ASEAN. Singapore has also done this through the Ministry of Foreign Affairs Singapore Cooperation Program, as you can see on the slide here. So the BTRs are important, and so I would argue here that the biennial update reports, which is contained in one of Singapore's requests for proposals right now, is no longer a sufficient prerequisite for Singapore. because the biannual transparency reports have a much higher transparency requirement and many new complexities relating to it, such as using common reporting tables, common tabular formats, providing detailed national circumstances, details about your NDC, the use of IPCC guidelines that are of the latest vintage, and IPCC Assessment Report 5, their global warming potentials. So countries will actually have to estimate emissions also from the lack of activity data, so they have to project and estimate. And they have to provide time series data from 1990, and the reporting year is shorter than before, right? The BURs require a reporting year of X-4, but the BTRs require a shorter time period of X-2. Countries also need to report on the support that they've needed, received, mobilized, and so on. So the BTRs, as I've said time and time again, they are an important vehicle for compliance with Article 6 reporting requirements, and more generally, it's also a shall mandate under the Paris Agreement. So this means that it has to be a requirement for bilateral engagements on Article 6. So it is concerning that less than half of the countries that Singapore has signed memorandums of understandings with have actually submitted their BTRs by the deadline of 31st December 2024. But of course, as we discussed earlier, Singapore cannot make another country submit their BTR when they are not ready. But perhaps what we can do is to help build capacity and to nudge them through our eligibility criteria or requests for proposals. So on the matter of eligibility criteria and requests for proposals as well, just another quick point that it will be prudent for Singapore to ensure that these align with the published whitelist methodologies and that they are up to date, so that we can ensure that all discussions are as transparent as possible. One noticeable gap that I've observed, for instance, is the lack of nature-based solutions or nature-based methodologies beyond jurisdictional RED+ on the eligible methodologies list for Ghana. For Papua New Guinea, there are some allowable exceptions, but that there are nature-based methodologies, but the processes that are available for project applications are not particularly clear or as clear as the Ghana case in Singapore's implementation agreement with both these countries. So when the government issued and closed its request for proposals to procure high-quality nature-based carbon credits that are correspondingly adjusted, I was somewhat confused as to when we might see more nature-based methodologies added to the eligibility methodologies list. So some clarity on the alignment here would not only be helpful for researchers like myself, but also for host countries and the market as well. It is also difficult to find copies of the implementation agreement that has been signed between Ghana, PNG, and Singapore, but I did manage to locate the Ghana implementation agreement on the Ghana's Carbon Market Office website, although the annexes are not available online. And then, of course, the annexes are where the important information would be found. So this will also, if we cannot find the safeguards that Singapore has put in place, Singapore and Ghana have put in place, for example, it will prove challenging when it comes to mapping the quality of carbon credits against these eligibility principles, because as you recall, Singapore has taken steps to go beyond what Article 6 actually calls for, such as using the term permanent, right? So this will be very challenging for Singapore. Second, the ambition level of the NDC will affect the ability of host countries to undertake corresponding adjustments. If the country has an ambitious nationally determined contribution, this affects their additionality at both the NDC level and project activity level, and it limits the volume of Article 6 compliant carbon credits that can be availed to the international market. And over time, under the Paris Agreement, as countries are expected to improve and increase their NDC ambition, it could get harder for Singapore to find projects and countries for international carbon credits for achievement of its own NDCs. And about NDCs, it is a requirement that countries wish to participate in Article 6 that they have to maintain an NDC. However, last night when I was preparing for this talk, I checked, and none of the countries that Singapore has signed MOUs or implementation agreements with, all 19 of them, have actually submitted new NDCs for 2035 by the deadline of 10th of February of this year. So this means that our ability, Singapore's ability to trade ITMOs with these countries across the new NDC timeframe is limited. And without clarity on whether their targets are going to be more or less ambitious, Singapore could be at risk of having less ITMOs to buy if the host country NDCs are more ambitious because it affects additionality, or we could incur reputational risk if the countries from whom we plan to buy it most with reduce or regress their NDCs from the earlier version. So I'm coming to the end. So while Singapore's emissions is now planned to go on a downward trajectory after peaking in 2028, the truth is this is only so on paper. And to maintain Singapore's credibility and our reputation as a climate leader Singapore should be clearer as to how much of the downward emissions trajectory is planned to come from the use of international carbon credits, and how much is to come from reviewing our consumption levels and embarking on meaningful decarbonization from the deployment of low carbon technologies. And the reason this is important is because being clear on policies helps to send the right signals to everyone, not just the market. And getting from the peak of 64.43 million tonnes in 2028 to the lower bound of 45 million tonnes of CO2 equivalent in absolute numbers is 19.43 million tonnes in just 7 years. How is Singapore going to shave off nearly 20 million tonnes of CO2 emissions from our emissions profile? What are the trade-offs? What will it cost us? How will Singaporeans cope with the possibility that some, or maybe most of this 20 million tonnes might come from carbon credits? So the reductions could be made in another country, but then put on our ledger. And this is assuming that the host country actually does the corresponding adjustments. As if they don't report it in their BTRs, it won't be recorded. Can Singaporeans accept this future? The National Climate Change Secretariat's most recent online public consultation results actually showed that some respondents were quite against the use of international carbon credits to pay their way out of decarbonization, and their use should be accompanied by plans to reduce carbon emissions. And should the same be expected from the Singapore government if they are to be buyers of international carbon credits then? Where is the carbon accountability? Will Singapore be accused of carbon colonialism? A lot remains to be seen since we now have zero issuances of international carbon credits for use towards our NDCs. But as things progress, we must take temperature checks on what Singaporeans actually want to see in terms of the achievement of our NDCs. And indeed, what matters is not just that we get there, but how we get there. Singapore is also considered a front runner in Article 6, but we are not the only buyers. This is something to take note. There are several other countries that are in competition for these high-quality carbon credits, including Switzerland, Sweden, Norway, Japan, South Korea, the United Arab Emirates, Australia, and Monaco. They've all expressed interest and have already signed multiple agreements and MOUs with countries. So President S.R. Nathan shared in his memoir that when he took up office in 1999, he quickly discovered that he needed to develop his own approach and not feel the need to accept the ways that had always been done by past presidents. So in the same way, Singapore must also continually develop our own new approaches to this global challenge of climate change. And with this level of competition, we can't afford to rest on our laurels, but must also work towards decarbonization of our own economy where possible, and to ensure that the use of carbon credits can truly advance global climate action and ambition. Singapore must do its best to engage with our counterparties or host countries, and we need more people like yourselves to step forward. We need more of you to take an interest in how countries are addressing climate change, setting their NDCs, asking the right questions, and of course holding each other accountable. We must keep fighting the good fight to find solutions and to forge pathways forward. To this end, my team, a bit of a plug here, my team at the NUS Centre for Nature-Based Climate Solutions are running some training programs on carbon markets, as well as to update everyone on legal and regulatory issues on climate change in Singapore. So we encourage you to register and to join us on this journey. So with that, I conclude, and I want to thank you all for listening.
Thank you, Ms. Low. For those watching the seminar on Facebook, please submit your comments and questions to the Facebook comment box. For our audience members here, please step up to the mic to ask your questions. May I now invite Mr. Ruben Manukara, Global Lead, Carbon Finance and Markets Task Force at the Worldwide Fund for Nature International, Mr. Ho Xiang Tian, co-founder of Lepak in Singapore, and Ms. Kong Man Jin, co-founder of Just Keep Thinking, on stage to start the panel discussion.
All right. Sorry, can anyone hear me? Hi, okay. So good afternoon, everyone. I'm MJ. You might know me as BioGo MJ, and I'm your moderator this afternoon. So I manage Just Keep Thinking, which is a science and educational media channel that shares, a lot about scientific environmental information to the mass audience. So in a way, I'm a science communicator. I also had the privilege of co-leading the youth delegation team for COP29 in Baku, and hopefully this year as well. So we hope that you guys enjoyed Melissa's presentation and deepen your understanding of the COP process, specifically Article 6. I acknowledge it's quite deep, but I assure you that you're learning from one of the best experts in the field. And just to give a little bit of a short summary of what Article 6 actually means, Article 6 underpins the creation and functioning of international carbon markets by establishing the rules and mechanisms for trading emissions reductions between countries. So specifically, Article 6.2 permits the transfer of ITMOs, mitigation outcomes, which allows nations to trade surplus of carbon credits, while 6.4 creates a centralized framework for generating carbon credits through approved sustainable projects. And there's also a 6.8, which is like the non-market approach, but it's okay, we talk about 6.2 and 6.4. Okay, so capiche everyone? Formulate your questions in your mind. And now we are fortunate to have with us an additional 2 distinguished speakers who will share their experience on international carbon markets and Singapore's climate commitments. Our dialogue today centers on the pivotal role of international carbon markets in aiding Singapore to achieve its nationally determined contributions, also known as NDCs. So we actually submitted our 2035 NDCs on February 10th to reduce our greenhouse gas emissions to between 45 to 50 million metric tons of carbon dioxide equivalent, aligning with our net zero emission target by 2050. So as we proceed, I encourage you guys to formulate the questions that you have in mind, and we'll open the floor to a Q&A in about 20 to 30 minutes. And for our online audience as well, please send in your questions, and we'll pose them to our panelists during the Q&A segment as well. Segment, sorry, I say as well twice. So to kickstart our conversation, I would like to invite our 2 panelists, the one who just joined, Ruben and Xiang Tian, to introduce yourselves briefly, especially the experience that you have with regards to Singapore's climate scene. So Ruben, maybe you want to start first?
Thanks, MJ, and good afternoon to everyone. And firstly, thanks for NUS and IPS for inviting me and having me on this panel. And thanks to Melissa as well for the good overview. I do recognize that carbon markets can be a relatively intense and dense topic, but she did a very good job in trying to distill the key concepts. So I am the lead for the Carbon Finance and Markets Task Force with WWF International. So as part of that role, I provide strategic advice to WWF on how the organization should engage on carbon markets and finance, but also WWF's partners, and these include some large multinational corporations, but also governments, on how they should use carbon markets in a manner that positively benefits people, nature, and climate. Prior to that, I used to work for the Singapore government, and so the National Climate Change Secretariat, and I was the lead negotiator for Article 6 at the UNFCCC across 3 COPs. So happy to share on that as well.
All right. Just a fun fact as well, Ruben was one of those who started the youth delegation program, bringing youth to officially to COP28, which I was one of the first batch, and also subsequent years. So thank you, Ruben. I think it's important for the younger generation to know as well what's happening beyond the borders of Singapore, right, and how global negotiations take place out there in the greater world. And one of those who joined me at COP28 is Mr. Ho Xiang Tian right there. You can give a short introduction of yourself to our audience here.
Okay. Hello. So my name is Xiang Tian. I run an environmental group called Lepak in SG, which has 3 main goals. One on climate, one on waste, and one on nature. Then apart from that, that's like my night job. So my day job, I'm actually at SMU doing climate research under Professor Winston Chow. Yeah, currently working on a climate adaptation project and looking at how climate change will affect Singapore. So how Lepak is involved in the whole climate thing. I have 2 teams. One team looking at decarbonization within Singapore, and one team looking at how Singapore's decarbonization will affect other countries. Yeah, so for the team looking in Singapore, it's about, looking at things like industrial emissions, emissions from power generation and emissions from transport. And then for the overseas impacts, it's like what's the impact of our renewable energy imports, what's the impact of CCUS, as well as the impacts of carbon credits that we'll buy from other countries. Yeah.
Thank you so much, Xiangtian, for the introduction. And I have to say, just a shout out to him also. He one of the very few youth groups that actually looks at policies, study them, and try to explain them to the mainstream audience to make it as palatable as possible. So thank you, Xiangtian, for your contribution. I'm one of those that reads a lot of what you guys do and put out there. So, I mean, everyone knows Melissa, right? So we can move on to the question. And during the Q&A, everyone please post your questions, then we can direct it to the fellow panelists. So we'll start with you, Ruben. So since you have a lot of insights on global developments in carbon markets, how do you feel about the recent global developments in carbon markets and how they might influence Singapore's strategy for integrating carbon credits into its national decarbonization efforts?
Thanks, MJ. And maybe I wouldn't touch too much on global developments, but highlight some key points that Mel shared about earlier, which is the first development to take note of is clarity when it comes to rules. I think a lot of work in the UN has been happening the last 3 years, and that has resulted in the rules for carbon markets being decided upon. And what that means is countries now have clarity on if they want to use carbon markets, how do they go about using it. So that's the first key development. The second, somewhat related to the first, is a number of countries now publicly stating that they intend to use carbon markets, right? So Malaysia mentioned the countries that are already in the weeds striking carbon credit agreements, but there are many countries that have indicated intention to use carbon markets or indicated that they're open to using carbon markets. So for example, in the UK released its 2035 NDC, and while they said that they have no plans to use it, they retain the right to use it should they need to do it in a later stage, right? So that's the second important development to take note of. But, and MJ, on your question of how does this relate to or connect to Singapore's climate ambition? And at this point, it's important to take a step back and understand the role of carbon markets, right? And the context of why it was included in the Paris Agreement in the first place. It's commonly somewhat misunderstood that carbon markets is a tool to allow countries to meet their climate targets. The intention of carbon markets is to promote higher ambition. It's a means for countries to go above and beyond and take more ambitious climate targets than they would otherwise have undertaken. So that's the fundamental premise in the using of carbon markets, and that has to be central in any country's strategy, including Singapore, on how the country intends to use carbon markets. And the second concept on carbon markets is that carbon markets is used, and in particular carbon credits, the fundamental principle of using it is that it's used to offset residual emissions, which means emissions that no matter how hard a country, a company tries, it cannot be reduced, right? So it's not the first tool you go to when you're deciding to decarbonize, but it's the last tool that you go to where after everything you've done and you don't have any more means to decarbonize, you reach for the tool that's called carbon markets or carbon credits, and you use it to meet your ambitious climate target that you've set. So in that context, Singapore's use of Article 6 must always be seen through the lens of the carbon tax. And the carbon tax is what it is. Its intent is to drive domestic decarbonization, which is why it covers over 80% of the economy, and it puts a price on carbon in Singapore to incentivize companies, and many of these are the largest polluters in Singapore, to undertake domestic decarbonization. And even for the companies, as what Melissa said, it's a very small cap of 5% that they can rely on for carbon credits, right? So looking through that lens and looking how Singapore has made the ambitious step of ratcheting up its carbon price, it's quite clear. The priority is domestic decarbonization. And the cap further reinforces that, and reinforces the principle that carbon credits are only to be used for residual emissions. And wearing a hat as a form of conservation organization, I was heartened to see that principle or being reflected in Singapore's 2035 NDC as well. While there could have been more clarity into the amount of carbon credits, as what Melissa said, it made it very clear that carbon credits would only be used for residual emissions. So it's a continuity of carbon credits and high integrity use of carbon credits. Thanks, MJ.
All right, thank you, Ruben, for that great summarized sharing. And indeed, I think especially for a country like Singapore, where we are disadvantaged in many different ways, resources, land, energy, there are some areas that we do have to leverage on the use of carbon credits. But like what you said, for residual emissions. And I think this gives a lot of clarity. And please keep those questions coming in as well. And now I'll move on to Xiang Tian for you. Hold on, yes. So we talk a lot about carbon markets, and also first and foremost, we have to decarbonize domestically, as a nation. And there are many other ways of decarbonization, right? So here's where Xiang Tian can share some insights. So beyond carbon markets, what other decarbonization pathways should Singapore prioritize to achieve its emission reduction targets?
Okay. So if you look at Singapore's emissions as a pie chart, about 40% of it comes from energy, about 40% comes from industry, and about 16% comes from transport. So these add up to about 96%. And this is where most of your efforts need to be targeted at, right? Because the three big sectors. So transport is sort of the most straightforward one, in my opinion, in that Singapore has already announced that we are phasing out internal combustion engines or ICE vehicles, right, by 2040. So it's either you have EVs or hybrids. And I think that over time, we'll probably be moving towards fully EVs. So this sort of pushes the burden of decarbonizing your transport to the power generation sector. And next for industry. Industry is quite a big chunk because we have a lot of refineries and petchems. I think the current strategy is to go for energy efficiency and increasing the efficiency of the industrial processes. But I also think that in the near medium future, I think Singapore would be trying to phase out the more pollutive industries and leaving only what is the most efficient. Yeah. So that's for industry. And then finally, it's power. So power is quite interesting in that currently Singapore is using 95% natural gas for electricity generation and something like 0.8% solar, 1% coal, 2 to 3% waste to energy. So if we are to hit our 2035 target of 45 to 50 megatons of CO2 emissions, then we would need to change the makeup of our electricity generation. So I think Singapore has already announced that we will be importing something like 6 gigawatts of renewable energy from the region. EMA says that this is 1/3 of Singapore's projected electricity needs in 2035. So, okay, there's a lot of assumptions here, okay, but assuming that the proportion of emissions from electricity generation remains the same, this 6 gigawatts would give us roughly 8 megatons of carbon abatement. Okay, yeah, to put it in perspective, we will be 60 megatons in 2030. We need to hit 50 to 45 by 2035, right? So that's 10 to 15 lah. So moving imported energy can give us about 8 megatons. I think NCCS in their, was it the BTR or was it the NDC? They said that CCS would be about 2 MT, so that's 10. So if Singapore is going to be super ambitious and reach our 45 target of being 45 megatons by 2035, that means that your shortfall of 5 megatons would need to come from carbon credits. Yeah. So okay, and this is also assuming that all the renewable energy projects that come in smoothly. Our neighbors north and south don't suddenly decide to interfere with the renewable energy projects. Yeah, and other stuff. Yeah. So, this is roughly how I see it. Yeah.
Oh wow, you did a full-on investigation. No, that was great. You helped us answer all of our questions. And for those of you who would like to learn more, especially domestically, what Singapore chooses to do, you can read on our NDCs online right there. It's pretty comprehensive. But thank you so much, Xiangtian, for sharing with the audience on the other decarbonization methods. And with that, let me see if there's anyone who would like to ask some questions. So we're just about in at 5:02. I do not want to hog up any of your time by posing my own set of questions. So perhaps anyone from the floor would like to ask any questions? We have mic stands on all four corners of the room. So if you would like to ask a question, you may please go ahead. Is it you? Oh, you. Bye-bye. Are you going off? Oh, that's so sad. We still have half an hour to... Okay, bye. All right, it's okay. You? Oh, yay! We have one question. Thank you so much. So we'll take your question, and then I'll move on to the online seminar. Some of the online audience have asked some questions as well. So please, you may introduce, your name, and you can ask your question.
Hi, I'm Thana Chandran, and I grew up in a kampung area of Singapore. So I'm quite from the old era. Now, while I believe, I've just jotted my question while you were having the talk. Now, while I believe it's possible to mitigate climate change in Singapore, the current evidence suggests that inefficient efforts has been made. Now, climate tractors, international climate tractors, which I'm sure you're aware of, have annually stated that Singapore is inefficiently developing, critically inefficient in developing climate change policies. It appears that more resources has been used for verbal declaration than action. Nothing much has been done for encouraging current generation on enhancing naturalistic intelligence, which I've seen overseas. I've been working for 30 years overseas on environmental matters, and we are nowhere there, sadly. I would like to see more action rather than more policies being said. That's just my view. Thank you.
Oh, okay. All right. We have one more question. Okay, we'll take both, and then we'll reflect to the panel. Sorry, you were... Oh, no, it's okay. We can take both, and then we'll pose it to the panelists.
Okay, hi everyone. I'm Terence. I used to work on Article 6 at the World Bank. So actually, I'm here because of Mr. Ruben. He's my idol.
Wow.
Yeah. Okay, I'm just joking. But I have a quick comment actually on the research from Melissa, which is that I think we have to take a step back and understand that fundamentally the Paris Agreement is a voluntary mechanism, as what we've seen from President Trump, right? He just put out. So I just have a feedback to the audience that perhaps we might not want to be too kiasu towards the host countries and take a mentality that the host countries are out to get us. Because I actually did some capacity building work at the World Bank before, helping the host countries to set up all the infrastructure, and it's actually quite sobering. Some of the host countries, their government officials don't even have a government email, so they use their personal email to get in touch with us. And then sometimes when we talk to them halfway, then the internet cuts off. So a lot of the host countries don't even have the infrastructure to set up Article 6, yet here we are trying to criticize them. Oh, you never submit your BTR on time. They may not have power to finish their BTR. So I think we should be more empathetic towards the host countries and also go back to the fundamental principle which was espoused at Kyoto Protocol, which each country has a common but differentiated responsibility. So I think my question to Mr. Ruben, right, is that now that you have moved on from policy making and now you're in the implementation space, how has the journey been, and any tips on encouraging youth to move from advocacy to action? Thank you.
All right. So we have the two different questions. Are you ready? Yeah. You look like you're ready to answer. Okay, you can go ahead.
Thanks, MJ. I can take a first step. And I think, and thanks for the two questions. And Terence is being very kind, but he's an incredibly capable carbon markets professional as well. So I think the two questions are somewhat interlinked. In the sense of, to answer the, or maybe one way to look at the first question would be, what is the role of the different actors when we're talking about addressing climate change, right? And what is the role of government versus what is the role of companies and individuals, for that matter, and other institutions like academia, right? My view is that one of the fundamental roles of government is putting in place the right policies, regulations to enable and drive climate change. Now that doesn't need to be the only role. The government can directly invest in decarbonization, for example, and who knows, that's something they might do through carbon credits or otherwise. But it's one of the fundamental roles of a policymaker is to create the enabler to drive action, right? And as was pointed out, that has been a big part of the focus of the Singapore government. And I think that has materialized through the form of a carbon tax, which is mandatory, right? So it's a step further than suggesting, and it's saying that you have to do it, or you should pay a tax, right? So it's putting a price on carbon, which would lead, if companies choose to adhere to this, and they must because it's law, drive domestic decarbonization. So the fundamental principle is then, can the Singapore government do more? Yes. I mean, any government can do more. We are grossly behind on where we should be in terms of climate action. And every country and entity and individual needs to do more. I think we're very close to missing the 1.5 degree target. If not, it's really gone. So we do need more pressure and support also to allow individuals, countries, and companies to take on more ambitious goals. So, but one need not necessarily come at the expense of the other, right? And it's about how we take a whole of society, whole of system approach to create the enablers for different parts of society to do as much as they can. And the second question is to flow on that. From policy making to now working in an NGO, fundamentally, I do see it quite similar, right? You're guided by the same North Star, which is how do you support globally everyone, whether it's countries, people, achieving the goals of the Paris Agreement, right? And what my realization is that there is a gap between policy and climate action. And now the question is, how can that gap be filled, right? Because having a policy is one, and being in a position to translate that policy to action is another. And that's why I firmly believe that's where the other ecosystem players come in, right? There's a role for academia, for example, as Melissa highlighted, through capacity building, to help improve or shorten the knowledge gap. There is also a gap that needs to be filled through financing, for example, where you have the policy levers, but ultimately you need the finances, the finance institutions to come in as enablers to do that, right? So a reflection from moving from policy to where I'm sitting now, where we're looking at climate change in a much broader lens, is that we need these different actors to bridge that gap, to move from policy to action, and that involves different ecosystem players playing their part.
MJ, can I respond?
Yes, of course. Go ahead, Melissa.
So I thought to respond to the first question by Farah. So you are talking about the climate action tracker, right? Where Singapore has, I think, a couple of times been identified as its NDC is critically insufficient. I would probably stay tuned for the next round of assessment because, as I said earlier in my speech, Singapore is now on a downward trajectory, right, from 60 to 45 to 50 million tons, which is aligned with net zero, finally, right? So in the past, it was an upward trajectory, and now it's on a downward. So I'm quite certain that after the submission of the 2035 NDC, Singapore's rating under the Climate Action Tracker should improve. But I also like to add on to what Ruben shared is that the truth of the matter is the NDCs, the first round of intended nationally determined contributions were never going to be good because they were submitted pre-Paris. So imagine going to a conference, not knowing what the rules of the game are, and being expected to submit a target. And also knowing that it would be a review and ratchet mechanism, right? You are expected to every 5 years increase your target up and up and up. Logically, if you work for the government, you will submit something that is very low because every 5 years you've got to keep increasing it, right? So it's not surprising actually that Singapore submitted, like all countries, submitted a number that we would be comfortable to meet, right? So the nationally determined contributions, as the name suggests, is nationally determined. So then it leads me to the second question about whether the Paris Agreement is actually voluntary. In fact, I would like to respectfully disagree that it is voluntary because while the Paris Agreement does not require obligations of outcome, right? So the nationally determined contributions actually need not be met, but countries do need to account for it. So it's an obligation of conduct, not outcome. Right? So the BTRs, countries went in knowing and they negotiated the Article 13 outcomes. So I feel like it's a bit too late to say I don't have the capacity to do it, right? I understand the difficulties, but 99 countries have submitted. So why can't Singapore select from the 99? Countries that submitted the BTRs for collaboration on carbon credits. Instead, half of the countries only have submitted BTRs, or less than half. So I think we need to do more, but I take your point on the challenges that developing countries face. But it is absolutely critical, as Ruben and I agree, BTRs are going to be a vehicle. They are a vehicle for reporting Article 6. So without the BTRs, Singapore will be at risk of not achieving its NDC if we do intend to use, and we've announced 2.51 million tonnes that will be used in 2030. So the remaining countries that we have signed MOUs and will be signing implementation agreements with will have to get their act together and will have to submit their BTRs. Otherwise, there will not be corresponding adjustments, right? So let's say we submit 2.51 million, but the countries from whom we buy don't add it back to their inventories, then it's double counted, right? So there's no other way apart from the BTR. That is the vehicle. I mean, there's the centralized accounting reporting platform and reports, but the BTR is the main one. So thought to put it out there. I mean, we can agree to disagree, I suppose, but I would say that the Paris Agreement is legally binding on the parties that choose to be a part of it. And unfortunately, with the second Trump administration, he has moved to withdraw the US from the Paris Agreement. We kind of saw it coming, right? But it's already in force. So for the rest of the 190-something countries, we just do what we need to do.
All right. Xiangtian, do you have anything to add on? Okay, I hope that answers both of your questions. And with that, let me take a look at the online question. Sorry, your key. Sorry, may I get your name again? Terence. Oh yeah, Terence. Do you answer a question in the question sheet? Oh no, not yet. Okay, because someone asked a similar questions. Okay, so we have one question from our online audience. Since Melissa mentioned about US pulling out from the Paris Agreement immediately when Trump took over. So there's a question from Fuzaya Taha online. So first of all, she thanked you for your incredible presentation and proud that we're on target of his commitment ahead of many other countries. And she asked that, recently we heard that US might withdraw. I think they've already did. But I would like to hear the panel's view on how this might impact or undermine the collective efforts of other countries. I know you briefly mentioned the point, but maybe you can elaborate on that.
So just to say, it takes 1 year for them to actually withdraw.
Okay.
Yeah, so it won't come, it won't be official. So okay. President Trump has signed the executive order, but they have to deposit, I'm not sure if he has, they have to deposit the instrument with the UN headquarters, and then 1 year later, it will come into effect. I mean, this doesn't change very much. I think what is more concerning is their domestic policies, right, in the US. So it certainly is a setback, I think, for the rest of the world. But as I said earlier in my remarks, I think we have to move forward. Hopefully, at the end of this 4-year term, there will be another administration that will put the US back. But I mean, that's the nature of the Paris Agreement, where it allows countries to sign up and withdraw if they like. And actually, the US is the only one that has done this a couple of times now, which is very unfortunate. But the rest of the world is still, I think, as far as I understand, they remain committed to the Paris Agreement. And frankly, it's the only vehicle we have, the only regime that we have to take us, hopefully, under 1.5 degrees warming. So genuinely hope that, the US also, in the last Trump administration, when he had withdrawn from the Paris Agreement, there were subnational bodies, and of course California, that really rose to the challenge. And I think we will see that again, where I think groups within the United States will actually come forward and challenge the federal's stance on climate change.
All right. Okay, that's a relief to hear. Any of our... Okay, looks like our panelists do not have... I hope that answers your question for Fuzaya. Okay, we have another question. How does... Sorry, now give me a time to... Oh, this is a very interesting one. I'm not sure if it's okay to ask, but you know what, let's try, because in a way, it's two different policies that might actually conflict with each other. So how does Singapore's climate policy stance interact with its pro-family stance and population policies, considering the impact of overpopulation environmentally has been detrimental, while states around the world still see a need to increase? Yeah. So, anyone would like to give an interesting take on that?
I can try.
Yes,
Thank you.
Please feel free to chime in. But I think it's separate. So regardless of our climate policies, the pro-family or pro-childbirth rate policies will still carry on. And I mean, economically, Singapore wants to reach, like they have certain targets, and we have certain expectations, right? Like maybe we need 6 million, 6.5, maybe 6.9 to reach certain economic targets. And it's either, I mean, if Singaporeans don't give birth, then we would encourage people to immigrate to Singapore in order to make up for the workforce to reach that economic target. So in that sense, it's not related because no matter what the economic, okay, I can't say that, but no matter what the economic target is, if Singapore has a net zero target already, then we will also still try to strive towards meeting our targets, because Singapore does not like to over-promise. We like to under-promise, over-deliver, rather than like the reverse. So I would not think that they are in conflict. Yeah.
No, I think you have a good point. Oh, Ruben, you want to say?
Yeah. Maybe just to add on that as well. So I guess where the question is also coming from is the notion or the relationship between growth and climate change, right? Where you have a economic growth or population growth, it's seen as directly causing climate change, which is not wrong in some sense, because that's how the Industrial Revolution and economic growth in the traditional way of relying on fossil fuels to fuel industry has caused the problem. Right? But there is a realization among many countries now of rethinking growth, right? And rethinking growth in the form of growing in a more sustainable manner when it comes to climate, but also when it comes to other areas, right? In circularity and inclusivity and so on and so forth. So it's really this notion of how can we redefine growth, and whether it's looking at different indicators, for example, or whether it's looking at different ways to drive growth of industry. And I think countries are doing that already. So, I mean, Singapore's context, there's what's happening in terms of importing renewables, but in also looking at incentivizing green sectors, right? Adoption of, electric vehicles is another example. So I think maybe a way to answer that question would be asking a fundamental question of, can we decouple traditional growth while addressing climate change?
think that's a fair point. And also, hopefully, I think the country has also taken into account its population predictions on how Singapore will grow before they come out with their own targets. And, technically, if you green the grid, then the population growth wouldn't have that much of an impact. And also, I think this brought up a very important point about balance, right? Like we can achieve and put all of our money and effort into achieving our climate goals, but there's other sectors of Singapore that the government has to take care of, including things like the finance side of things, right? We drive all these big companies away and our economy suffers. Then usually the people who suffer the most are the ones at the bottom. They're going to get at the short end of the stick. But also things like, even about building HDBs and stuff. So it's a sensitive topic, but there are people who really, really need a house. And therefore, it's really about, for Singapore, I believe, it's about finding that balance that we need in order to make sure everyone is slightly happy, in a way. Okay.
Sorry, I just want to jump in on Ruben's point.
Sure, go ahead.
I mean, like the degrowth concept.
Not degrowth, is
or like redefining growth. I think it's very interesting, but also something that not any one country can do alone. So it's a bit like dealing with climate change, right? Like if without Paris Agreement, Singapore says we go net zero tomorrow, like nothing will change. So I guess for redefining growth, it could be the same. Like I actually think the other way forward is a Paris Agreement style for growth rather than just on climate. Yeah, but I don't know if
It kind of is. It kind of is if you think about it, right? Because any form of climate target is a constraint on your economy, constraint on your carbon. Yeah, so Singapore announcing the 45 to 50 is a constraint on the carbon if the intention is to decarbonize, right? Rather than offsets. But even offsets means that somebody else somewhere else is doing that decarbonization for us, or just buying the right to pollute somewhere else, so to speak. Yeah, I would say it's in conflict, but then what is the cost, of the alternative scenario where we don't have enough people to sustain the country, not just the economy, right? The country itself. Yeah, which is a bigger topic than what we're discussing today, much bigger.
Right. Thank you so much. Anyone else? Yes, you may please head to the mic. If anyone of you who would like to ask a question, you can head over to the mic so we can take multiple questions at once. So, sir, you may go ahead.
Yep. So, Chris Gay from the Institute of Policy Studies. Just to sort of come back to a point that I think either Melissa or Ruben you made about this idea of carbon colonialism. And I think you said it in the context of Singapore acting as almost like a bully, right? But might I proffer another sort of approach in where Singapore could then, instead of acting as a bully, act more like a leader, a convener of best practice, capability building? Is that a possibility? Is that something that maybe this country should be taking more of a leadership role, given the sort of the breakdown of the multilateral efforts in this regard?
So in my doctoral research, actually, I'm finding that there is a proliferation of carbon accountability studies, and that's where the term comes from, right? Carbon colonialism. So in my speech, I was warning against the potential perception of Singapore as a carbon colonial country, in that in the past, under the Kyoto Protocol, only the developed countries had reduction objectives, right? So they had targets. Developing countries or non-Annex 1 countries did not have targets. So Singapore is in an interesting situation in the Paris regime because although we are still listed as a developing country, we're looking to use carbon credits like in the Kyoto regime where the developed countries bought credits from the developing world. Now Singapore as a developing country is going to buy carbon credits from the developing world. So when you map it like that, there is a threat of others calling us a carbon colonial country, which I'm not seeing Singapore's name popping up in academic studies just yet, but in studies, there was a study published in Nature end of last year that talked about Singapore's additional carbon accountability because, as Xiang Tian pointed out, we are home to a number of refineries. So the study actually pointed out that we have exceeded our carbon budget, for example, because we are actually enabling other countries to emit by refining the products that they use. That's not even accounted, in our inventory, because that's the scope 3, as we call it, right? That's stuff that we export. So it's not just academic in that sense, right? We do have to think very carefully about the narrative that we're putting out. Maybe, as you point out, a better narrative that we can build for ourselves is to pursue best practices, to pursue meaningful engagement with other countries. Actually, another thing I've noticed in my studies also is that Singapore actually, I've been told that we might also lose out in terms of securing MOUs and implementation agreements, because the number of countries that I mentioned who are also front-runner countries, they have been in those countries in the developing world using aid for many more years than we have. So when it comes to deciding who wins the bid, some of these developing countries will say, oh, Japan, you've been here for ages longer than we have. Diplomatically speaking, I'll give you the contract. Yeah, Singapore, you've not really been around for that long. Yeah, so we could lose out also in terms of the deals, but all of this not said in public, right? Yeah, quite interesting, and lots will be unfolding in the next few years, especially in the next 5 years, because 2030, we will need 2.51 million. How we do it is going to be important so that we're not accused of being that bully, right? Not accused of land grabbing, of forcing others. There's also a concept of benefit sharing. Maybe Ruben can also touch on it, but usually in these new deals, under the Paris Agreement, not 100% of the units will come to us. Typically now, the developing countries are asking for a share of the carbon credits to be given back to them for achievement of their own NDCs. Yeah, I don't know if you want to elaborate a bit more.
So maybe 2 points. One is a broader point of fully agree that we are very far away from where we should be in terms of climate action, and we need more climate leadership in this space. At the same time, the reality is that different countries can exercise leadership or should exercise leadership in the best way that they can, right? So, for example, recognizing Singapore's context, right? You're a small island state and with very unique circumstance in terms of small land size, city-state, high population density, etc. So then the question is, in what areas can Singapore exercise leadership? One way is just as what Melissa said, which is in the area of international negotiations, right? Where every country has a seat, and Singapore has, over many years, exercised leadership through rulemaking. And that is something that, as Singapore residents, as Singaporeans, would come naturally to us. We have a good track record of rulemaking and encouraging implementation of those rules, right? And we've seen that in Singapore exercise thought leadership. It's not only in carbon markets. So, for example, our chief negotiator for climate change was the one that co-facilitated transparency, or rather, the global stocktake, which is part of transparency. Similarly, we played a hand in helping to negotiate the outcomes of the Paris Agreement as well. So, as what Singapore has done in the space of international rulemaking, we need to also encourage other countries to exercise climate leadership in the best way that they can, fully recognizing that one country can't do everything, and this has to be a multi-country-led effort. Yeah.
All right. Okay, so thank you so much for your views. And right now, we have 2 questions. There's also one question from online. So I'll take both of your questions and the third questions, and then we can all answer all 3 at the same time before we wrap up. Okay, so please, you may ask a question.
So much for this conversation. So I am Kalpana. I am a senior research fellow at IPS, but my question today is really more on the role of a parent. So parenting young children, right, I can see that they're extremely, they're constantly asking me questions. Does this release carbon dioxide? They're very on top of a lot of the education, the climate education, right? And I'm listening to you guys talk today, I'm thinking, do you feel like, the carbon tax, these carbon markets, are these the downstream effects? Is it going to be sufficient to actually make our behavior change? Because the kind of educational gap is very obvious to me in what's happening amongst young people, their ability to understand, the types of behavioral changes that they need to put in place, their willingness to make those changes. are the things that you've been talking about here today, are they going to be sufficient to change the, the much larger population of the not so young Singaporeans and their ability to understand and also, I guess, have their own commitment to what is needed to happen? Yeah, thank you.
All right, thank you so much. The gentleman behind, you may pose your question.
Good evening, everyone. Firstly, thanks to the panelists for the insights thus far. I'm Brian, an undergraduate from NTU. So I was wondering, given Indonesia's change in leadership to President Prabowo, who seems like quite protective of their developmental agenda, what might be some of the difficulties faced by Singapore in achieving like carbon credits cooperation with them, with Indonesia being like one of the MOU countries that Singapore is collaborating with? Yeah, thank you.
Okay. And for the panelists, one last question from KH Pua. NDCs are voluntary and supposed to be downward, but what to do with errant companies in countries with lack enforcement despite their targets? I think it's a little bit related to the question that the gentleman asked. So 3 questions. So first about, the climate education, and is our carbon tax actually sufficient and other measures sufficient enough to make the change when there's actually a gap in the educational aspect? Some difficulty of achieving the targets with certain countries, and also, how about in countries with the lack of enforcement despite their targets? So perhaps any of you would like to take the questions?
Yeah, I can take the Indonesia one and the young children one. Okay. So Indonesia has also recently announced, I think, intention to withdraw from the Paris Agreement. So very easy. If they've withdrawn, they cannot participate in Article 6. Simple, right? So Singapore will not be able to procure international carbon credits for use towards its NDC if the Indonesians withdraw. So it remains to be seen if they will withdraw, because they could stand to earn windfall profits, I think, from selling carbon credits, right, from their forestry, peatlands, and so on. The issue about young children, I totally understand. I was recently part of the Ministry of Education's lower secondary geography syllabus review committee, very long name. Happy to say that actually they're now moving to add climate change more in the lower secondary syllabus. Typically, you would find it only in the upper secondary, which is, as you all know, if you've been through the Singapore system, not everybody gets to take full geography, right? Social sciences, sometimes you go into the sciences, but lower secondary geography is mandatory in the schools. So by adding Paris Agreement, climate change in there, potentially has some effect. The problem is teachers, right? Sometimes teachers are not particularly well equipped to be updated on all these complex terms and how can they relate it to young children, 13, 14 years old. I remember once I went to a similar midterm review of a syllabus, I think it was H1 to H3, and we were talking about the SDGs, right? So I'm wearing the SDG pin, Sustainable Development Goals. And I think there were some teachers that were very worried about the large number of indicators that they had to teach, or how to measure Sustainable Development Goals. They were just saying, I have 2 or 3 lessons, I can't teach hundreds of indicators. So I think maybe it's also time we maybe look at capacity building for our teachers in Singapore. And not just geography, it shouldn't be just geography teachers, right? It should be all teachers may need to be upskilled on climate change, on sustainability, because it's an existential issue for Singapore. Hopefully it will be enough, but I think it will take all hands on deck to make it enough. Yeah, I have nieces and nephews also, and I know how difficult, they actually point out if you use plastic nowadays, more so than the adults, so yeah.
Maybe I can add on the Indonesia answer as well. So I think the Indonesia position is relatively nuanced. I mean, for context and background, so Indonesia had imposed a moratorium on the sale of carbon credits internationally. And among other reasons, one of the reasons cited was that they were in the process of developing a model of developing carbon projects and internationally trading carbon credits in a way that is fair and equitable. Fair and equitable to the country, fair and equitable to the local communities, etc. So they said, give me some time, let me work out the frameworks, etc. Until then, there will be no trading. So that was the context, and that was very recently lifted, and Indonesia said, I have now developed my own standard of how carbon credits should be created in Indonesia, and if you want to do carbon credit trading, you have to follow that standard, and then you can trade it. And they approved quite recently the first few projects to do that. What that means for Singapore remains to be seen. Singapore has taken the early step of said that, okay, these are the benchmark of quality when it comes to the credits that Singapore will buy, and that might or might not be aligned with what Indonesia has said they'll do nationally. So then how does Singapore react to that? It remains to be answered. I mean, as with any multilateral negotiation or bilateral negotiation, it is an iterative process, but we have to see whether how carbon credit projects that come in under that international collaboration and which standard they will align to.
On the last question, did the question refer to companies or countries?
What to do with errant companies in countries that lack enforcement despite their targets?
But that's the sovereign decision of each country to decide what the penalties are for each country. So it's very hard to answer the question without further context. Yeah.
No, fair enough.
I'll just jump in back to the first question on children and carbon tax and whether it will affect their behavior, right? So we did some calculations before. $50 carbon tax, if translated into energy, I mean like the gencos, they need to pay the carbon tax, right? So if they pass it entirely down to consumers, $50 carbon tax is about 2 cents per kilowatt hour. So if you are a relatively wealthy family, let's say you're middle class or upper middle class, you use 400 kilowatt hours per month, that would be $8 per month to your household bill. And the question is whether this $8 per month, when passed down to you, is enough to teach your kid to, not use the aircon, use the fan, whatever, right? That's one. And then the other thing is also that this $8 per month is also dependent on the grid emission factor. So if currently we are using 95% natural gas, 3% waste to energy, 1% solar, 1% coal, then yes, it's $8. But if you are getting renewable energy imports, if you are getting hydrogen into your power plants, this value will change and it probably drop. So it's also like, is a lower number enough to make you teach your kids?
Will it drop though? Because imports, they could pass through the cost of the
the
transmission into Singapore's grid.
But the carbon tax itself will
And the
will
land
reduce.
cost for putting the storage, the batteries, will be passed through too. So it could increase actually.
But specifically, the amount of cost passed down by the carbon tax will drop. Yeah.
Fair enough.
So yeah.
Okay, it remains to be seen, but I think it's a very good conversation. Sorry, Sandy,
Oh no.
do you? Oh, okay. Well, thank you so much for sharing that. I think a lot of the questions have been answered, but our panelists will probably be able to take some more questions afterwards. We are running out of time, so I'll wrap it up very quickly with a quick summary. So first of all, Ruben gave an idea of how Singapore might be affected from the carbon market, so the developments of carbon markets. So now countries have more clarity on how to use carbon markets, and countries are also indicating intention to use carbon markets. So, and the importance of carbon tax, as to incentivize our domestic carbon markets. And then also, Xiang Tian gave a broad overview of Singapore's energy pie chart, highlighting transport, industry, and power, and also how imported energy can give that 8% of 8 megaton that we need. Okay, and then we move on to talking about investment of decarbonization that is probably driven by the policymakers, and carbon tax is one important way to do so, and we will need the whole of society effort to do it. There's a gap between policy and climate action, and that's where the ecosystem of academia, capacity building, financing institutions will come in. So everyone plays a different role, take different action, but we are all heading towards the same North Star. We also talk about the relationship between growth and climate change. And there's a talk about rethinking growth, especially in terms of circularity, looking at different indicators. We briefly mentioned a little bit of carbon colonialism, but it's stating a fact that Singapore might be seen that way, and we do not want to be seen that way at the end of the day. So we want to have a better narrative for Singapore, pursuing meaningful engagements, best practices, and I think we have done so in quite many ways that might not necessarily be shared online. So if you do look through the reports, I personally have seen how hard the team has worked, international negotiations. We are hard worker, and we say, when we say things, we do mean it. And that's something I'm really very proud of in Singapore. We also have a talk about climate education, about carbon tax, how is that enough? But I think at the end of the day, we realized that we need all hands on deck, and everyone has a role to play. And common things about sustainability, climate change is not limited to just the green and sustainability sector, but to all sectors in Singapore. And with that, I hope you guys have enjoyed this panel discussion and dialogue. And I hope you guys can give a round of applause to all of our panelists. Thank you so much for being such a great audience, and I'll hand over the time back to the MC.
Thank you. We have come to the end of today's seminar. We would like to hear your views on the event. Please click our link on the Facebook feed or scan the QR code on the screen to submit your feedback. Thank you all for attending today's seminar. Just a shout out that our next SR Nathan Fellowship lecture will be by Mr. Philip Yeo, 16th SR Nathan Fellow on 6th March, which is next week. Have a good evening ahead.